It was a kind of afternoon that Oxford reserves for those too stubborn to accept the summer's departure. A faint drizzle clung to the air, but the cobbles were dry enough to echo the brisk steps of students hurrying to late lectures. I lingered, as I always did, near the Radcliffe camera, the familiar geometry of its dome holding more comfort than most human company. The leaves had begun their surrender. Amber, russet, and ochre lay strewn like the remnants of old manuscripts across the quad. I remember adjusting my scarf and thinking, as one does when the season shifts, of mortality in the most trivial sense, the passing of warmth, the shortening of days, the hollowing out of evenings. There is a dignity to decay here, a mannered retreat. Perhaps that is why Oxford has always seemed to me the perfect stage for murder, death woven seamlessly into tradition. I carried with me a newspaper folded twice over, though I had no real intention of reading it. One learns to glance, to skim, to notice. A small article on page 7, almost lost between accounts of railway delays and the failure of a local council budget, caught my eye. A retired don from Exeter College had been found dead in his rooms. Natural causes, said the brief line, though one would not expect any other conclusion in such a publication. Still, the phrasing struck me as hurried, perfunctory, like the answer to a crossword clue filled in only to complete the grid. Too neat, too swift. I thought of Exeter, then the pale stone, the echoing staircases, the way the smell of old books clings to every wall like ivy. I'd walked those halls often enough to know their peculiar silences. A man dying quietly there would hardly disturb the rhythm of the place. Yet silence, in excess, unsettles me. It carries the suggestion of something withheld. My deduction, if one could call it that, was no more than a flicker of suspicion born from years of noticing small incongruities. The article mentioned the man had been discovered by a junior fellow who visited each Thursday for chess. Yet the day was Wednesday when the discovery was made. What had prompted an uncharacteristic visit? Curiosity, concern, or something less benign? Like the crossing of a word against the grain of its clue it snagged. I walked then through Broad Street, the drizzle turning to a fine mist. Bicycles leaned wearily against railings and shop windows reflected the blurred silhouettes of passers-by. I remember hearing the faint notes of an organ drifting from a chapel, somber chords dissolving into the wet air. Everything seemed suspended between the ordinary and the portentous. I felt, as I often do at the threshold of a case, both weary and alert, caught in that paradoxical tension that has governed much of my life. At the Randolph, I paused, not to enter, but to watch the carriages and buses jostle for precedence at the crossing. People's lives, I thought, intersect with far less order than the traffic. Some are halted, some pressed forward, some overturned entirely. The Don at Exeter was already being forgotten by most, but I suspected he had left behind more than mere academic footnotes. I should confess that I seldom trust first instincts. They are too easily confused with prejudice. Yet this one clung to me, irritatingly persistent, like a half-solved puzzle whose answer whispers from the margins. I thought again of the chess match, of the irregular visit. It was, I admit, a thin thread to tug at, but I have found that thin threads, when drawn gently, sometimes unravel entire tapestries. I turned back towards my rooms, the bells of St. Mary's chiming 4, their sound muffled and mournful in the autumn haze. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, and somewhere close by, a bicycle chain squealed in protest. Such details linger in memory long after the larger facts fade. Perhaps that is why I recount them now. For it was on that damp and restless afternoon, with the season tipping into darkness, that the case began to take root in my mind. Not with a scream or a discovery, but with a small article, a curious visit, and a sense of silence too carefully arranged. The rooms were smaller than I remembered. Exeter had always struck me as slightly mean with its space, as though knowledge itself required narrow walls to press against. The stairwell groaned under my step, a thin thread of dust uncoiling in the air as I pushed open the door. It was early evening now, the drizzle sharpening into rain, and the window panes quivered faintly in the wind. The bed was neatly made, untouched for days it seemed, and the chessboard on the side table remained mid-game, a knight poised awkwardly against a pawn. That was what unsettled me first. The board spoke of interruption. A scholar dying in his chair was one thing, a scholar leaving a puzzle unfinished was another. Men who live in books dislike endings that are not tidy. I found the air stale with pipe smoke, though no pipe was visible. A faint outline on the mantel suggested where it usually rested, and yet it was gone, as if taken deliberately. I stood for some minutes in that room, listening to the rain begin its soft percussion against the glass, and I thought of how absence leaves louder echoes than presence. The missing pipe, the paused chess game, the silence too carefully arranged. These were the footnotes in a narrative others had hurried to close. A young fellow appeared in the doorway, his voice carrying a tremor of courtesy over discomfort. He told me he had been the one to find the Don, that he had called for the porter with as much calm as he could manage. I asked, as casually as one asks about the weather, why he had come on a Wednesday. He hesitated just long enough to betray the act of rehearsal, then said he had been asked to bring over some manuscripts. No details, no titles, just manuscripts. His shoes were damp, but the rain had not begun until after dusk. That much I knew because I had walked through it myself. A discrepancy as small as a dropped stitch, but it lingered. I let him speak, and he did, about the old man's brilliance, his irritability, his solitude. He described how the room always smelled of ink and smoke, and I almost smiled at his unknowing confirmation of what I had already noticed. His eyes wandered once or twice towards the chessboard, quickly away again. He had lost more than a mentor, I thought. He had lost an opponent, perhaps the only one who tested him. After he left, I sat for a while in the scholar's armchair, my hands resting on the worn arms, the fabric smooth where fingers had pressed over decades. A faint indentation remained on the cushion, a ghostly outline of the man who had occupied it. I thought of mortality again, though more sharply now. Death reduces everything, the dense arguments of philosophy, the bitter debates in common rooms, the careful footnotes and citations. All silenced, folded away into an obituary no larger than a paragraph. On the desk lay a crossword torn from the Times, half completed, with the ink blotting at one corner where the pen had lingered. A clue caught my eye, 12 across. Academic exercise, 3 letters. He had written lab, yet the crossings suggested ace. A trivial mistake, or perhaps a mind already slipping away. Still, I circled it with my finger. Even the cleverest minds falter, but I have found, time and again, that errors in crosswords are rarely without resonance. Some betray haste, other interference. The rain thickened outside, dripping steadily from the gutter. Somewhere in the quad a bell rang, muffled, like a voice behind a door. I rose and moved once more about the room. The missing pipe, the unfinished game, the wrongly answered clue. None of it is proof, of course. Proof is the privilege of laboratories and courtrooms. But suspicion, quiet and persistent, is the detective's only true inheritance. When I left the lodgings, the stairwell was darker than before, the air colder. I felt the case not yet a case, not officially tightened around me. And as I stepped into the damp night, the rain clinging to my coat, I thought of the Don's final move. Whatever it had been, someone else had answered it, and perhaps that was why the board remained unfinished. The lecture theatre smelled of chalk and damp coats, that particular mingling of the abstract and the ordinary, theory written on the blackboard while raindrops darkened the sleeves of the audience. I had attended countless such occasions, though not often from the front row. The Don's death had brought me here. seated among a scatter of students whose faces betrayed only mild interest, as though the gravity of scholarship had become routine. Perhaps it always had been. The lecturer, a thin man with restless hands, spoke of medieval philosophy in a tone too quick for reverence. His words fell like loose coins on stone, clattering more than persuading. I caught fragments only of virtue, the problem of universals, the inevitable shadow of mortality. Yet I was less concerned with his arguments than with the room itself. The silence that rose after each statement was too brittle, too rehearsed, as if something unspoken hung at the edge of the discussion. I watched the students more than the speaker. One girl leaned forward as though eager to catch every word, but her pencil remained still upon her notebook. Another young man tapped his boot softly against the rung of his chair, his rhythm too deliberate to be unconscious. A third, older than the rest, sat apart, his eyes fixed not on the lecturer, but on the high windows where the rain traced thin paths down the glass. Grief shows itself in unexpected ways, and I wondered who among them had known the dead beyond the lecture hall's formality. At the end, there were questions, or at least the ritual performance of them. A student asked whether the old texts had any bearing on the modern world. The lecturer answered with a shrug that it depended on how much one valued the past. His voice cracked on the word valued. I thought then of the chessboard in the lodgings, the knight marooned mid-move, the crossword answer gone astray. We misvalue often what is closest to us, a gesture, a word, a silence. As the audience dispersed, I lingered by the doorway. I overheard two students whispering, though whispering only in the sense of lowered voices that wished still to be heard. One said it was strange he had died alone when he had been seen in the Bodleian the evening before, looking uncharacteristically agitated. The other replied that the old man had enemies, though in academia the term enemy often means little more than a rival footnote. Still, I caught the way the second student's hand fumbled with his satchel strap, pulling too quickly as though rehearsed excuses had become habitual. I found myself drifting toward the lectern once the room had cleared. On the desk lay a stack of essays, margins scarred with red ink. One page bore a sharp annotation carelessly. Think again. The word careless underlined twice. I closed the folder quietly, but the words stayed with me. Careless. It was not in the Don's nature, I thought, to let care slip. And yet the crossword told me otherwise, unless, of course, the pen that wrote the answer had not been his. I left the hall as the bell of a nearby chapel struck the hour. The rain had stopped, though the stones shone dark with what they had absorbed. I walked slowly across the quad, my shoes striking echoes into the damp air. I thought again of the lecturer's crack on values, a slip of voice, like the slip of ink across a crossword grid. Small mistakes that betray larger truths. It is in such fissures that I find my way. The evening light was dimming when I reached the gate, the sky torn between gold and grey. The lecture had offered little, in fact, but something in its tone, its shadows, had confirmed what I already suspected. The Don had not left life tidily. He had been interrupted, and somewhere among the silence of students and the quick hands of colleagues, there lingered a trace of who had interrupted him. The porter's key turned reluctantly in the small oak cabinet, as though even brass and wood resented my intrusion. I'd asked politely, though not too politely, to see whatever letters remained in the Don's pigeonhole. The porter, a man whose memory seemed longer than his patience, muttered something about privacy and propriety before yielding. I have found that porters, like policemen, live by routine when that routine falters. Suspicion is never far behind. The envelopes were unevenly stacked, some already opened, some stiff with fresh glue. A postcard from Venice, a bill from the bookseller, an invitation to a faculty dinner long since past. Yet one envelope caught my attention, Not because of its handwriting, though the hand was unusual, left slanted, impatient, but because of its absence of a date stamp. Delivered, then, by hand. The address bore no college crest, no indication of origin. A plain sheet folded twice inside, words pressed sharply into the paper. "You must stop." 3 words, nothing more. No signature, no elaboration, as though the writer believed elaboration unnecessary. I held the paper against the light and saw where the nib had hesitated at the M of must, a tiny blot spreading like a bruise. Hesitation suggests conflict, even in so curt a message. One does not pause unless one considers not writing at all. I slipped it back carefully, though the porter was watching me with narrowed eyes, as if I had trespassed upon a sanctity I would never quite understand. Later, in my own room, I poured a whiskey and unfolded the sheet again. "You must stop." Stop what? Publishing, perhaps. Arguing. Breathing. The ambiguity was deliberate, I felt. A scholar thrives on ambiguity, and yet ambiguity in a threat is cruelty. It leaves the mind to construct its own gallows. I thought of a small exchange during the lecture. A student had asked whether truth was timeless. The lecturer had replied that truth was malleable, like lead waiting for shape. The student had smiled faintly, though the smile was not of amusement but of recognition. A gesture overlooked by most, yet the kind of fleeting acknowledgement that binds 2 people in secret. I remembered it because it had seemed, at the time, inconsequential. Now it breathed differently. The letters gave little else away. Receipts, trivial notes, even an advertisement for spectacles. Yet the postcard from Venice drew me again. The handwriting did not match the threatening sheet, but the message was oddly cold. The weather is pleasant. Crowds are tolerable. Work is progressing. No name attached, only an initial. V. Relationships reduced to fragments, as though intimacy had been filed under abbreviations. I walked that evening along Turl Street, the rain slicking the cobbles to mirrors. My thoughts returned not to the Don, nor to his students, but to the shape of letters themselves. Words can deceive, but ink betrays. The threatening note's ink was darker than most, fresh enough that it had not yet faded. Whoever had written it had done so within days of the man's death. Urgency, then, and perhaps regret. Crosswords are built on such ambiguities, definitions concealed within definitions, answers that only make sense once found. I remembered the Don's error lab for less, and considered whether it had been an error at all. Perhaps it was a message, an attempt at leaving behind something coded, a final move in a game only one other player would understand. Or perhaps it was merely fatigue. One never knows. That is the cruelty of the dead. They cannot confirm our deductions. I returned the envelope to the cabinet the following day, telling the porter nothing. He looked relieved, though his relief seemed too studied. Silence again. Silence carefully maintained. The Don had lived among words, but died in silence, and his letters, these fragments of voice, only deepened the hush. When I left the lodge, the evening bells were sounding. Their echoes folded into the damp air, into the narrow lanes that have carried secrets for centuries, and I found myself wondering whether the ambiguity of those 3 words was not only deliberate, but final. You must stop. He had, and yet the echo of that command had only just begun. There are evenings when Oxford seems to fold in on itself as though the streets wish to retreat from the tread of footsteps. That night I found myself in a small wine bar off Holywell Street, the sort of place where bottles line the walls like silent jurors, and conversation is always hushed, conspiratorial. I had no company, nor did I want any. The rain had driven most people home, and the few who lingered were intent on their glasses, not on one another. I ordered a Burgundy, deep and old, its taste sharp at first, and then receding into something almost forgiving. Wine is not unlike memory. It grows softer as it lingers, though it never quite surrenders its bitterness. I drank slowly, my thoughts on the dawn, on the unfinished crossword, on the letter with its 3 words. Each detail pressed itself forward only to retreat again, like a motif in an opera, returning when least expected. Opera had always been my solace, though sometimes I wondered if it had not also been my ruin. The bar owner kept a small radio behind the counter, and by some accident or providence, Puccini drifted through the speakers. La Bohème, the familiar lament, voices swelling against the narrow space. I felt again the old ache that art insists upon beauty yoked to sorrow, pleasure bound to loss. The music reminded me of the scholar's room, the chess game left suspended. A melody cut short. The silence after a note is sometimes the loudest sound of all. Across the room a man sat alone, his coat still damp from the rain. He looked at me once, briefly, and then away. Recognized him, though not at first. One of the students from the lecture hall, the older one, who had stared at the windows rather than the speaker. He raised his glass slightly, not in greeting but in acknowledgement, as though to confess that both of us preferred shadows to conversation. He left before I could think of an excuse to follow, but his presence lingered, unsettling. Students rarely drink alone in places where professors haunt the corners. It spoke of restlessness, perhaps even fear. I let the wine carry me back to the crossword. The clue that had troubled academic exercise, 3 letters would not leave me. The Don had a written lab. The crossing suggested S. But in the rhythm of the puzzle there was also another possibility. A word that fits both clue and circumstance. A man at the end of his patience might leave behind more than a mistake. He might leave a fragment of his despair. The thought unsettled me, though I knew better than to lean too heavily upon such interpretations. Yet I circled it again in my mind. Try. It seemed almost a plea. The aria rose to its quiet close, and for a moment the bar was still, even the clinking of glasses hushed. I thought of how opera insists upon endings, upon the inevitable collapse of passion into death. Life rarely offers such symmetry. The Don's death had not been operatic. It had been abrupt, inelegant, unfinished. And yet, like the final act of an opera, it had gathered its own audience, students, colleagues, porters, detectives, all of us straining for meaning in the pauses. I left the bar late, the streets empty, the rain easing into mist. The towers loomed pale against the sky, and somewhere a clock struck the quarter. My coat clung to me, heavy with damp, and the burgundy had settled into a slow warmth in my chest. I thought again of the student who had raised his glass. Too deliberate, that gesture. Too rehearsed. As if he had been waiting for me to notice. At my room I poured another measure of whiskey and let the silence expand. Wine and opera had given me little in the way of answers, but they had sharpened the questions. A threatening letter, an unfinished crossword, a student with restless eyes. Each a note in a score I had not yet deciphered. And as I closed my eyes, Puccini still echoing faintly, I felt the case lean closer, like a melody returning, insistent, unresolved. The Bodleian after dusk is unlike any other place in Oxford. The tourists long gone, the scholars dwindling to a few stubborn silhouettes, the air filled with the quiet sigh of pages turned. I have always thought of it as a mausoleum for words, a chamber where voices from centuries past are preserved in silence. That evening, the silence was heavier than usual, as though it had absorbed some knowledge better left unspoken. I'd come with permission, reluctantly granted, to examine the late Don's borrowing ledger. Such ledgers are tedious, dull lists of titles and dates, yet they tell more truth than the recollections of friends. People lie, sometimes unknowingly, books do not. The librarian, a woman whose hair resembled the parchment she guarded, placed the volume before me with a look that suggested she disliked disturbance of any kind. I assured her I would be brief. She did not believe me. The ledger was large, its spine stiff, ink faded in places. I traced the Don's hand through the months, seeing the rhythm of his habits, theology, history, the occasional foray into mathematics. A neat, disciplined order until the last weeks. Then the pattern wavered. A sudden interest in criminal law, a volume on poisons catalogued in the medical section, a slim book of Greek tragedy withdrawn on a Tuesday and returned the following morning. Such departures are seldom casual. Men of letters wander, yes, but they do not stumble. The change unsettled me. I paused at one entry dated only 2 days before his death, a work on ciphers, borrowed and not yet returned. A coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps not. The crossword came back to Metri, Lab, Essend. I wondered if the Don had been playing a deeper game, one whose rules I had not yet glimpsed. I closed the ledger, but the thought remained, pressing at the edges of my mind like the faint echo of a bell. Leaving the reading room, I found myself drawn to the lower stacks, where the smell of dust and leather thickens, where footsteps echo too loudly. There I met the junior fellow again, the same one who had claimed to discover the body. He greeted me with surprise, though his eyes betrayed no delight. He said he was searching for a reference book misplaced from the shelves. I asked, which book? He hesitated, then murmured something vague about comparative law. The same subject, I noted silently, that the Don had pursued so suddenly. Too neat, that overlap. He shifted on his feet, his hand tightening around the railing of the staircase. His knuckles whitened. I asked if he had known the Don well. He said well enough, though his tone suggested otherwise. I asked if they had played chess often. He nodded, and I saw it then, the faint scar near his thumb, the kind left by a pawn when pressed too tightly into the board. A nervous gesture, perhaps repeated during games. The scar was fresh. A man carries his habits in small betrayals. I let the silence extend until he excused himself, leaving more quickly than he ought. His footsteps echoed too loudly in the stairwell, fading into the labyrinth above. I stayed where I was, staring at the rows of books, thinking of how knowledge shelters both truth and deception. Shelves cannot choose which they contain. When I left the library, the quadrangle was dark, the lamps casting small islands of light on the wet stones. I thought again of the ledger, of the ciphers borrowed, of the student's scarred thumb, of the hesitation in his voice. None of it yet formed a picture, but the outlines were beginning to flicker. A man does not abandon his discipline without reason. A man does not borrow a book on poisons unless something has already poisoned his mind. The bells struck 9 as I crossed Radcliffe Square, their tolls folding into the mist. I carried with me no proof, only suspicions, but suspicions have a way of hardening into fact if one listens long enough. That night, as the stones gleamed under the thin drizzle, I felt the case tightening, not with revelation, but with the slow, insistent pressure of unanswered questions. Oxford breeds its own distractions. For every truth there are a dozen detours, and I have followed too many of them in my time. That week was a tangle of such misdirections, each one dressed in the borrowed robes of significance, each one demanding attention. Yet when stripped bare, they revealed little more than smoke. I recall the fellow at Magdalen who swore the dead Don had quarreled with a publisher. He said manuscripts had been delayed, payments withheld, reputations threatened. It sounded promising, for nothing breeds malice so effectively as intellectual pride bruised by commerce. I walked across to the publisher's office, a cramped building near the High, its windows clouded with dust. The man there, bespectacled and impatient, told me the quarrel had been no more than a delay in proofs. An irritation, yes, but hardly murder. He spoke with such weary indifference that I believed him. Another thread frayed. Then there was the porter's insistence that a stranger had been seen in the quad late on the evening of the Don's death. A man in a dark coat, tall, purposeful, slipping through shadows with the air of one who belonged nowhere. I searched, of course, questioned, listened. No one had seen him again. It may have been imagination, or perhaps the porter wished to cloak his own unease in invention. We often see phantoms where silence presses too hard. And there was the matter of the Don's sister, a reclusive woman in the countryside. A letter she wrote surfaced briefly in my hands, sharp, full of disapproval, as though her brother's academic pursuits had squandered some family duty. It suggested bitterness, perhaps even resentment. Yet when I visited her, she appeared only tired, resigned to a solitude chosen long ago. Her grief was quiet, almost too quiet, but it carried no malice. I left unconvinced, but with nothing to hold. Each of these diversions left me weary, though weariness has been my companion for longer than I care to remember. I would sit at night with whiskey in hand, the crossword before me, the unanswered clues mocking my fatigue. One evening I noticed a detail I'd overlooked, a clue unfinished, a smudge where ink had dragged across the margin. The Don had been left-handed, yet the threatening note in his pigeonhole, its ink dark, its nib halting, was written by a right hand. A small thing, perhaps meaningless, but red herrings often reveal themselves by running in the wrong direction. The student with restless eyes returned to my thoughts. His hand bore that small scar from the chessboard, his stories shifting like sand. He was no red herring, I felt, yet I had no proof, only instinct, and instinct is easily clouded by prejudice. Still, I found myself watching for him in every hall, in every library corner. Once I glimpsed him, late, leaving the Bodleian with papers pressed tightly under his coat. He vanished into the mist before I could follow. So the days moved in circles, and I was with them. The city seemed to conspire with the confusion. Bells rang out of sequence, rain arrived without warning, even the pigeons shifted strangely across the squares. Distraction everywhere. And yet, in the midst of it, I remembered an old rule of puzzles. When too many answers present themselves, the clue has likely been misread. The solution lies not in multiplying options, but in reconsidering the question itself. The Don had borrowed books outside his discipline, had left a crossword unsettled, had received a letter whose ambiguity gnawed at me. These were not diversions, they were fragments. The red herrings were everything else, the quarrels, the strangers, the resentful relatives. Noise meant to drown the signal, and I, foolishly, had listened too long to the noise. I walked that night through the cloisters of Exeter, the stones damp beneath my step, the lamps casting pale halos in the mist. I thought of how the truth rarely strides forward. It hides, timid among false leads, waiting for the patient's ear. My patience was frayed, but not yet spent. The red herrings had swum past. It was time to follow the faint current they concealed. It was late when the knock came. I had been sitting alone, the crossword folded beside me, the whiskey glass half drained, Puccini's voice trailing faintly from the wireless. Oxford sleeps uneasily, even at night, and so I assumed it was only a porter, perhaps with a message misplaced. But when I opened the door, I found instead the student, the older one, the restless one standing with rain on his shoulders and a look too carefully arranged across his face. He asked if he might come in, his words clipped as though rehearsed. I stepped aside without answer, letting him enter the small room where books leaned in crooked rows and the air smelled faintly of tobacco. He remained standing, glancing at the crossword, at the whiskey, at me. He said he wanted to explain, though he offered no question to which explanation had been demanded. I waited, because silence is often more persuasive than interrogation. He spoke of the Don, how he had admired him, how he had resented him, how their chess games had grown into arguments too subtle for words, but no less bitter. He confessed to visiting that final evening, uninvited, hoping for reconciliation. Yet when he arrived, he found the door locked, the room dark. He lingered in the quad, uncertain, until leaving with the shame of his intrusion. So he claimed. His voice faltered only once, when he said the word dark, too much weight placed upon it, as if darkness had meant more than the absence of light. I poured him a drink. He refused at first, then accepted, holding the glass awkwardly. His left hand, I noticed, remained buried in his pocket, unmoving. The scar on his thumb, visible when he shifted, looked rawer than before, red at the edges. I asked how it had been made. He smiled faintly, said chess pieces are sharper than they seem. But pawns do not bite so deeply. It was a poor lie, though spoken with the ease of one who lies often. The clock in my room struck 11, the sound muffled and heavy. He set the glass down, untouched, and asked whether I believed the Don had been murdered. I said nothing. He asked again, more insistently. Still I kept my silence. At last he laughed, softly, without amusement. He said Oxford had a way of killing men without touching them, and perhaps this death was only another kind of suicide. Then he left, coat collar pulled high, footsteps fading into the stairwell. I sat for a long time afterward, staring at the glass he had abandoned. Condensation traced a faint circle on the table, a ghostly ring. The crossword lay open to a fresh page. A clue caught my eye. 6 down. Visitor. Unexpected 5 letters. The answer revealed itself with cruel neatness. Guest. Too neat, too coincidental, like the student's sudden arrival at my door. The puzzle has a way of mocking reality, or perhaps reality enjoys arranging itself into puzzles. The rain eased outside, leaving the city in a hush, broken only by the occasional rattle of a bicycle chain. I thought of the Don's letter. You must stop, and wondered whether it had been written for the student. Perhaps the game had grown beyond scholarship, beyond rivalry, into something darker. Or perhaps the letter belonged to another entirely, and I was fitting clues where no connections existed. Ambiguity thrives in the absence of proof. I poured another whiskey and touched the rim of the untouched glass. Still cool. His visit had been real, though already it felt spectral, like an episode dreamt in half-sleep. The scar, the silence, the insistence. Pieces of a board still unfinished. I found myself staring at the crossword again. The word guest circled faintly in my mind, its letters almost too obvious. Yet obviousness can be its own deception. When I finally turned off the lamp, the room seemed larger, emptier. The visitor had left no trace but the ring on the table and the echo of his voice. Yet I felt the case shift quietly, as though a new move had been played. And in that hush, with Oxford sleeping uneasily beyond my window, I knew the puzzle had only deepened. I have always believed that the past is best approached obliquely. Direct scrutiny clouds the picture, but a sideways glance may catch the outline. That night, restless, I returned to my notes, to the letters, to the crossword, to the ledger. The caissif, one could call it that, had accumulated its own sediment facts, layered in disorder, fragments of truth buried beneath silt. And so I began again, sifting through what had been overlooked. The threatening note lay first before me. You must stop. Its bluntness was theatrical, almost too theatrical. Most threats I have found disguise themselves in courtesy, in elaborate turns of phrase. This one did not. I held it against the crossword the Don had abandoned, noting how differently the letters were formed. The crossword entries are tight, precise, left-handed. The note looser, hurried, right-handed. Not his hand, then. Yet what troubled me most was not the difference, but the echo, the Don's crossword mistake. That curious substitution of lab for s seemed to whisper the same message. A command to stop, hidden in error. Or perhaps I was only projecting my own need for pattern. I thought of the student's visit, his words rehearsed, his hand hidden in his pocket, the scar fresh against his thumb. Too many details that strained against chance. He had spoken of darkness in a voice that faltered, of Oxford killing its own without touching them. He had left his drink untouched. Fear tastes of abstention, but guilt too. The ledger entries unsettled me again. Books on law, poisons, ciphers, departures from a steady academic diet. Each borrowed in the last fortnight, each suggesting not curiosity but urgency, and then returned swiftly as if the knowledge sought had already been taken, absorbed. I asked myself who had benefited from those withdrawals. The Don, or another hand that guided him to them? Books leave trails, and trails are easily manipulated. I closed the ledger and poured another whiskey. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's tolled faintly through mist. Time in Oxford is never linear. It loops upon itself, bells repeating their solemn verdicts across centuries. I thought of the porter's phantom stranger, the sister's bitter letter, the publisher's indifference. Red herrings, all of them, yet not entirely useless. Even false clues reveal what others wish to hide. The porter sought to protect his own ignorance. The sister sought to bury her resentment. The publisher sought to avoid scandal. Each silence, each deflection, a small confession of its own. I unfolded the crossword once more. Another clue caught my eye. Scholar's pursuit of 4 letters. The Don had left it blank. Too easy a clue, surely. The answer could only be a book. Yet he had not written it. Why? Fatigue, distraction, death approaching. But perhaps also intention. A blank square left as silence, a silence that echoes more than words. I replayed the student's gesture in the lecture hall, the faint smile when the lecturer spoke of truth as malleable. At the time it had seemed no more than weariness, but smiles are betrayals. They surface when reason has not yet armed itself. He had known something then, known or remembered. I leaned back, my head heavy, the whiskey warm in my chest. Re-examination does not always yield answers, often it sharpens only the questions. Still, patterns emerged faintly as ink beneath erasure. The threatening note, the crossword's error, the borrowed books, the student's scar, each fragment no larger than a whisper, but together they suggested a direction. Toward what, I could not yet name. The rain began again, gentle against the glass, the city blurred into shadow. I closed the crossword and set it aside. Too many blanks, too many false entries, but I knew enough to continue. The truth lay not in the grand revelations, but in the overlooked margins, the small details dismissed. And so I resolved to look again, not harder, but more obliquely, sideways, where truth sometimes hides, waiting for the patient eye. The word has always felt too stark for what it conceals. Confrontation suggests noise, raised voices, declarations hurled like stones. Yet the most dangerous meetings arrive softly, cloaked in civility, the words measured, the silences louder than the speech. That night, in the college hall with its walls of darkened oak and its lamps throwing long shadows across the tables, I found myself face to face with the student. He had come willingly, though I sensed he had little choice. Perhaps curiosity drove him, or perhaps the guilty are drawn instinctively to the places where they risk being seen. He spoke first. His tone carried an edge of weariness, but also a defiance that seemed rehearsed. He asked why I pursued shadows, why I troubled myself with letters that might mean nothing, with crossword slips that could be accidents, with books borrowed and returned as any scholar might. He said the Don's death was natural, inevitable, and unremarkable. I listened, because listening reveals more than questions. His eyes, restless before, were now still, too still. Stillness is its own betrayal. I told him that Oxford is a city where nothing is unremarkable, not even silence. He laughed then, though without warmth, and replied that perhaps I saw patterns only because I longed for them. Perhaps I made ciphers where none existed. He said the truth is not discovered, but invented. His hand tightened against the back of a chair as he spoke. The same hand with its scarred thumb. The mark deepened as his grip did, a nervous gesture disguised as poise. I asked about the final evening. He claimed again to have waited outside the Don's room, seeing no light, hearing no sound. Yet his phrasing shifted. He said the curtains had been drawn. Earlier, he had said the room was dark. A small change, but in language small changes matter. Curtains drawn implies presence, not absence. A detail too easily overlooked unless one is listening obliquely. The hall was empty, but for us. A draught slipped under the door, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. The lamp flickered once, as if to mark the pause. I pressed further, quietly. I asked why he had come to my room that night, why he had stood in the rain rehearsing explanations before I had asked a single question. His silence was longer than his reply. He said he wanted understanding, that he wished someone to see the Don as he had seen him, brilliant, cruel, impossible to escape. But explanation, in excess, is often confession. I looked then at the crossword I had brought with me, folded neatly in my pocket. I slid it across the table. The clue, scholar's pursuit of 4 letters, still blank. He glanced at it and, without hesitation, wrote a book. His hand moved confidently, right-handed, letters tilted just as they were in the threatening note. Not proof, not in the way courts demand, but enough for me, enough to sharpen the outline of suspicion into something closer to belief. He did not notice my watching, or perhaps he did, and chose not to care. The clock struck midnight. Its chime echoed through the hall, deep, deliberate. He rose, straightened his coat, and asked whether I would accuse him. I said nothing. Silence is sometimes more powerful than accusation. He left by the side door, his steps deliberate, his shadow swallowed quickly by the corridor. I remained seated, staring at the crossword, at the word he had written. Book. Too neat an answer, too eager. Truth is rarely so tidy. I poured myself a whiskey when I returned to my rooms, the city already asleep, bells dormant until morning. I thought of confrontation, how it resolves nothing, how it leaves the air heavier than before. And I thought of the student, his scar, his silences, his words rehearsed and broken. Nothing proved, everything suspected. The game, like the chessboard in the Don's room, is still unfinished. The knight waiting to move, the pawn already gone. It is always in the quieter hours that the city reveals itself. Past midnight, with the rain stilled and the stones glistening in their damp sheen, Oxford seems less a place of scholars and more a repository of ghosts. I walked alone across Radcliffe Square, my coat heavy with the night's moisture, the echo of my own steps, the only company. The investigation, or whatever semblance of one I had pursued, had grown heavier with each detail, each letter, each silence. Yet answers remained elusive, and I was left with nothing but reflection. Back in my room I poured the last of the whiskey, its amber catching the dim light of the lamp. I placed the crossword before me, the grid no nearer completion than the case itself. Blank squares, false entries, clues that resisted sense. I traced my finger over the word he had written so confidently, book, and wondered if certainty had not been his gravest error. Life resists such neatness. The Don's crossword had been littered with hesitation. The student's hand betrayed none. That contrast lingered like a whisper of truth. I thought of the Don himself, a man who had surrounded his life with books, yet who had borrowed in those final weeks subjects foreign to his discipline. Law, poisons, ciphers. His choices seemed deliberate, yet whether out of fear or fascination I could not decide. Perhaps he had foreseen his end. Perhaps he had courted it, Oxford has a way of suffocating its own, the weight of knowledge pressing down until even the most brilliant cannot draw breath. Or perhaps I was merely weaving poetry over what was simpler than a man interrupted. The student returned to my mind with unwelcome persistence. His eyes fixed too long on windows, his words rehearsed then broken, the scar that betrayed nervous ritual. He had come to me, uninvited, seeking explanation where none had been sought. That alone condemned him in my private court. Yet suspicion is not proof. The law demands more than whispers and gestures. But I have never been entirely loyal to the law. My allegiance is to pattern, to the quiet music of deduction, to the way small incongruities reveal themselves if one listens long enough. I lifted the threatening note again. You must stop and study its ink under the lamplight. The hesitation at the M, the rightward slant. Not the Don's hand. Someone else's urgency bleeding into the page. Yet who had it been meant for? The Don, or perhaps another altogether? The ambiguity remained. And ambiguity is sometimes the truest condition of human affairs. We live in unfinished sentences, half-completed crosswords, gestures misread. The whiskey dwindled, and the room grew heavier with smoke and silence. I thought of music. Puccini, Verdi, Wagner, all composers who understood that the greatest moments arrive not in the crescendos, but in the pauses. Silence carries its own gravity. The Don's life had ended in silence, the chess game unfinished, the crossword abandoned. Perhaps that was his final statement, a refusal to complete what others demanded of him. Or perhaps silence was imposed upon him. I could not tell. I may never tell. I leaned back, the crossword still open before me, the blank squares staring up with quiet reproach. I remembered another clue, one I had overlooked entirely, 4 down. End of the matter, 3 letters. Too simple, almost mocking. Finn. The crossword's cruel humor. But I did not write it in. To complete it would be to pretend the matter itself was complete. And it was not. It lingered, heavy, unresolved. Outside, the bells began again, marking the hour with solemnity. Their sound seeped into the room, into the spaces between thought and memory. I closed the crossword at last and slipped the note inside and let both rest together. Perhaps answers would come, perhaps not. What remained was the quiet and the knowledge that truth like Oxford itself rarely offers itself whole. It waits in fragments, in reflections, in the pauses between words, and sometimes it waits forever. I had been given permission to see the manuscripts the Don had worked on in his last weeks. They were kept, as such things always are, under lock in a reading room that smelled of dust, leather, and the faint, sour tang of extinguished candles. The librarian produced them reluctantly, as though by doing so she betrayed the very silence the library depends upon. She placed them before me, one by one, and withdrew, leaving me alone with Parchment and suspicion. The papers were, at first glance, unremarkable. Notes on Aristotle, marginalia in Latin, fragments of translations. Yet in the margins I saw smudges that did not belong to stained circular, pale at the edges, darker in the center. Wine stains. No scholar with care for his work would leave such marks. Wine belongs to evenings, to conversation, not to the fragile parchment of centuries past. It was carelessness, or else intrusion. I touched one stain lightly. The parchment had warped beneath it, the ink bled faintly, words turned to shadows of themselves. The Don had been meticulous. His letters on the crossword proved that. The stain was not his. Someone else had placed their glass there, careless or deliberate. It was a desecration of scholarship, and desecration is rarely innocent. I remembered the student, the glass he had left untouched in my room, the condensation ring faint upon my table, a gesture mirrored now in this stain upon parchment. Patterns repeat, though we seldom see them until too late. The student had brought his presence into spaces where it did not belong. My room, the Don's lodgings, and perhaps here too. The thought pressed itself forward, though I resisted its neatness. Neatness deceives. Among the manuscripts was a slip of newer paper, folded twice, its edges creased by nervous fingers. A list of references, titles drawn from law, medicine, and cryptography, the same fields the Don had borrowed from the Bodleian in those final weeks. But the hand was not his. Too angular, too hurried. The librarian, when pressed later, would tell me no one but the Don had access. Yet access in Oxford is a fluid notion. Keys turn where they should not, doors open to the insistent. I leaned back, weary, letting my eyes travel across the dark beams above. The silence of the room pressed against me, heavy and insistent. I thought again of wine. How it comforts, how it betrays, how its stains last longer than its taste. In opera, wine is both solace and curse, the toast before betrayal, the drink that sharpens grief. Here, on Parchment, it was evidence of intrusion. Not proof, but suggestion, subtle, like the pause in a sentence where meaning shifts. I closed the manuscripts carefully, though the stains could never be undone. Outside, the rain had begun again, tapping softly against the leaded windows. I thought of the Don, seated perhaps with a glass in his hand, or perhaps without, his scholarship interrupted by another's carelessness. A ring of wine, a scar of red, a silence imposed. On the walk back through the quad, the lamps glowed faintly in the mist. I carried the image of the stain with me, as if it had imprinted itself upon my own memory. Small things linger longer than declarations. A crossword's blank, a scar on a thumb, a wine ring on parchment. Together they formed no solution, only a suggestion, an outline. But I have learned to follow outlines. They are often truer than the figures we fill them with. In my room I poured myself a measure, watching the glass leave its own circle upon the desk. I moved it quickly, wiping the mark away. Too late, of course. Stains remain, however much one wishes otherwise. And so I sat in silence, listening to the rain, the manuscripts locked once more in their guarded vaults, the memory of wine and parchment entwined. The case, unfinished still, pressed closer, though answers receded like the sound of bells fading into mist.